This Choircast podcast is brought to you by How to Not Suck as a Christian. This book is a witty, no BS guide to unlearning the toxic parts of Christianity, like purity culture, apologetics, and the idea that God's love is limited to straight conservative Americans. It's sharp, it's irreverent, and it'll definitely make your fundamentalist aunt clutch her pearls. You can get the audiobook on Audible. Print and ebooks of How to Not Suck as a Christian are available to ship to your aunt wherever books are sold.
Western Christianity has spent the last 2,000 years telling everyone they're separated from God.
This is Not Church with John and Nat Turney and Bethany Shea.
Well, hi, friends. Welcome back to the podcast. This is Not Church. As Nat says, if it was church, you would have left by now. And then he always talks about how I would try to lure people back into the church with hot cookies. But I don't know. Everybody comes in for cookies. I still believe in the church. I'm a pastor and I love what I get to do there. But at the same time, I know that there's been a lot of people who have been hurt and damaged and displaced through regular American Christianity. And we want to create spaces of inclusion and belonging here on our podcast. And that is one of the reasons why we call it This Is Not Church. Nat is not able to make it today. He had like a huge windstorm in Texas that knocked out his power and knocked down a fence. And so it will just be John and myself today with an amazing guest. But John, why don't you say hi to everybody?
Hello, everybody.
Nice. Awesome. We are joined today with an incredible guest. Lucas Wilson is with us today. And Lucas is an SSHRC Postdoctoral Fellow at University of Toronto Mississauga. How do I say that again? Mississauga, thank you. And he was formerly the Justice, Equity, and Transformation Postdoctoral Fellow at the University of Calgary. He is the editor of Shame, Sex, Attraction, Survivors' Stories of Conversion Therapy, which is one of the books that we're going to talk about today. And he's also the author of At Home with the Holocaust, Postmemory, Domestic Space, and Second-Generation Holocaust Literature, which actually received the Jordan... Oh, how do you say that one? The Schnitzer?
That's it.
First book publication award. His public facing writing has appeared in The Advocate, Queerty, LGBTQ Nation, and Religion Dispatches, among other venues. He's currently working on 2 interrelated monograph projects that examine evangelical, homophobia, and transphobia in the United States. So welcome to the podcast, Lucas. We're glad that you're here.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to chat with you all.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the first questions that we ask people that we have on different guests, just to kind of get some background information about them, is just to share a little bit about your faith journey. If you grew up in any kind of faith background and what that looks like in your life today.
Yeah, so I was not raised in a religious home. My dad was agnostic. My mom, I always say now that she was haunted by her Baptist demons. Otherwise, we weren't really a religious household. When I was really, really small, we would go to church. But when you finished, at noon, you came home and you shut the hell up about Jesus. You just didn't talk about God. It was sort of the way we did things. And like most, good Canadian families, we didn't go to church on Sundays. At a certain point, we went to the cottage instead. And so that's really sort of the religious background. And it was around grade 9 that I became involved in the church that I had gone to when I was younger, again, like on and off up until about grade 3. But my brother, one day was super, invested in the conversation about creation versus evolution. And he kind of hooked me on these DVDs back when DVDs were a thing. And it was this guy named Dr. Kent Hovind, who's, doctor is perhaps a term that should be used loosely when talking about Dr. Kent Hovind. He got his degree from a degree mill, but neither here nor there. And Kent Hovind... he had all these DVDs about creation versus evolution. He would debate these, different scientists and, philosophers and whatever. And he came from a very conservative, perspective. And so I started watching these DVDs, and eventually Kent Hovind went to jail for tax evasion and said it was God's money. The government disagreed. But putting that aside again, I was then at that point sort of, invested as well in the conversation. So I decided that if in fact I believed there was an intelligent designer, that there was a creator, I should go and figure out who exactly is this creator. And the first sort of place that I thought to go was that church that I had gone to again, on and off again when I was young. So went to youth group and got hooked immediately, was just, super involved. And went to church on Sundays, twice a Sunday, Wednesday nights, Fridays, whenever it was possible. And every sort of youth event I could get, go to, I would go to. And so, it was around grade 10, 11 that I also decided that I was going to go to Liberty University, Jerry Falwell's university in Lynchburg, Virginia. There's, of course, a lot to say about the name Lynchburg, but I digress. And so I went down and visited Liberty a few times before I eventually went there. And so Liberty's, of course, the biggest evangelical college in the world. And that's where I decided to do my undergrad. And we'll talk more about, about my experience there, just because I write about it in the book that we're talking about today, in conversion therapy. So what I talk about in the book was the group conversion therapy program that I was a part of, but I only went to that once. The individual program is what I went to over the 4 years. And because I'm writing another book, or editing another book more accurately, I decided that I was going to save the story about my one-on-one conversion therapy experience for the next book. So I just wrote about the group program. And again, we'll chat more about that. But that was in large part defined my time at Liberty, or in part, at least defined my time at Liberty. And it was after that I went, to grad school, and it was throughout the process of studying that I eventually gave up my faith. I'm no longer a person of faith, and I don't really identify as spiritual either, though a lot of folks seem to really resist that idea and don't like when I say that, but it's just the truth. And but yeah, I think for me, it wasn't even a matter of sexuality or gender or, anything, even just the church, the hurt that the church caused. That wasn't what pushed me away from faith. It was really my research. And most of my past research was on the Holocaust. And so just questions of theodicy and thinking about how do we reconcile a good God with, a fallen world, or to use, Christian language, fallen. And then from there, I shifted my focus, and now I focus on the new Christian right. So I look at evangelicals, Pentecostals, white Christian fundamentalists, specifically in the context of higher education, but beyond that as well. And I look at the influence that they've had on queer communities across the US and even into Canada. So that's a little bit about, my background and where I come from.
There's a lot of, you probably have seen just so much of the overlap between the start of the Holocaust with Christian affirmation in many ways. And there's a similarity right now with a lot of Christian groups that are very affirming of the direction our country is going, almost championing it and cheerleading it. And so when in your research with that, I know we're not talking about that book, but have you seen some of those correlations?
Well, you know what? My earlier research in the Holocaust, eventually I switched to looking at the intergenerational transmission of trauma between Holocaust survivors and their kids and their grandkids. But initially what I was looking at was the relationship between the Holocaust and Christian theology. And it's not even necessarily an argument that it's original to me. But whenever I would teach in my research that I have published on the topic, what I argue, and again, I'm standing on the shoulders of academic giants, and this is again in no way sort of personal or sort of coming from my own brain, is that without the Gospels, without then the interpretation of the Gospels and early Christianity onwards, we wouldn't have the Holocaust as it happened. And that is perhaps a bold claim. And for some folks that might, come across as sort of histrionic or, too much. But when we think about anti-Semitism and modern anti-Semitism, the vast majority of it really does come from Christian scriptures, right? So many of this anti-Semitic stereotypes that we have about, Jews being money hungry, greedy, folks. I mean, this is in part coming from Judas. This is in part coming from him being the purse holder, right? And there's other verses that talk about, if you ask perhaps the average person on the street, according to scripture, quote unquote, as if, scripture isn't interpreted, but, according to the Bible, who killed Jesus? And what folks will almost always say, perhaps not with, Gen Z, I don't really know what Gen Z believe or what they know. But what I will say about that, at least up until millennials, the number one answer is going to be that Jews killed Jesus. When of course we know that's not actually accurate, right? And so much of what we're talking about when we talk about the Holocaust, again, it wouldn't have happened, at least not in the way that it happened, using those anti-Semitic tropes and stereotypes and, sort of strawmen, this wouldn't have happened had it not been for Christian theology. But if we do fast forward to the, let's say, 1933. So Hitler's, comes into power in 1933. It's not until 1938, 1939, depending on how scholars define when the Holocaust, quote unquote, started. Though again, I think a lot of people would resist even those dates. But with that being said, with how you saw sort of the enthusiastic embrace of anti-Semitism, because it wasn't just like it came out of nowhere and Hitler sort of like stirred up a shitstorm and they were like, oh, let's buy into this. This, of course, was in the cultural consciousness for a long time. And so when we think today, if we're to take that, how the average German understood Jewishness and Jews before the Holocaust, and how the average U.S. citizen understands queers, whether that be genderqueer, sexual, queer minorities, whichever. This has been something that's been in the cultural consciousness for a long time, right? So we can think about how homosexuality, again, has been framed as a sin since at least, even before 1946, but really the word homosexuality is first introduced into scripture in 1946. You think about homosexuality as a mental illness. This is, of course, something that's been around since the term homosexual, which in the mid-1800s came into being, that this was attached to homosexuality and mental illness, right? There was that relationship established. And then on top of that, the idea of homosexuality as a social threat. This is something that's been in circulation for a very long time. And so, of course, none of these ideas are original to Christianity, but Christianity certainly mobilized a lot of them. And so I think that what we see with the two different time periods, right, just pre-Holocaust and then Trump, and then Holocaust and Trump, we can see again this enthusiastic embrace of pre-existing cultural ideas that were amplified in those political moments.
Wow. Yeah, absolutely. How do you find yourself staying centered or grounded in this season of life right now with what's happening in our country and being a queer person yourself? Like, how do you find spaces of safety?
Yeah. So, I mean, I do have the geographical distance, right? So I'm a Canadian. However, a lot of my life was spent in the U.S. You perhaps can, my accent always betrays me. People always, at a certain point in an interview, they'll kind of say, wait a second. And, but, being a Canadian, it does offer me, again, that like legitimate or like literal distance.
Yes.
However, it's something that, I gave, there have been, speaking engagements that have been offered to me that I said no to, and I'm going to say no to in the future because of what's happening. And of course, right now, and this really was showcased in the inaugural address, that Trump was targeting, specifically trans folks. Like, he wasn't saying queer in general. However, what we know from history and what we know from a lot of sort of, authoritarian movements is that they might start with a certain group, but it doesn't end there, right? Any minority and every minority will be targeted eventually. And so, there have been, since, Trump has been elected, we can think about, if we're talking about conversion therapy, there have been a number of bills in different states, whether it be Kentucky, or in, is it South Dakota? I'm not sure, but even Colorado, right, with the new court case that's going before the Supreme Court later this year, which is a terrifying prospect given how the Supreme Court is stacked, right? So there have been a number of bills that are pushing against protections against queer people as it relates to conversion therapy, right? So these are just some of the pushback. This is some of the resistance to the progress that's been made heretofore. And I think that, for me, I don't want to come into the U.S. anytime soon. I'm very nervous to come into the U.S. anytime soon. And on top of that, I feel terrible for so many of my queer friends who are in the U.S., particularly my trans friends, because of, again, the state of affairs. And so for me, again, I have that distance, so that's a luxury, right? That really is. But for so many people, that's not. And the reality is that they have to face this, again, new administration that's actively working against their very erasure. And I think that's something that needs to be noted. And again, not that the world necessarily cares. I mean, the world hasn't cared about a lot of different attacks on minority rights, globally right now, yesterday, the day before. But it is something that is alarming.
When you were at Liberty, did you have many allies around you, or did you feel very isolated? And then also on the same kind of curiosity, how would you invite us to be allies even more obviously in our day-to-day here?
Yeah, so when I was at Liberty, I identified with very little evidence as not gay, that I was bisexual. Again, where I got that idea from, that's still a mystery, because I've never been attracted to women. But with that being said, I was very much like a self-hating gay, right? And My sexual identity, how I identified sexually, I again made it up in my head. It was a fiction that was very convenient for me because it afforded me the delusion that I was going to be able to eventually just choose women over men because I was already attracted to women. No, I wasn't. But, I gave it the good old college try. And so I think for me, I very much was, again, I thought it was wrong to be gay. I came out to a few people, again, as a bisexual, to not a number, as I think there were many. There were, a handful of folks who I came out to. And all of us agreed that it was wrong. And so there was no community for me. I know since, the reason why the book that we're talking about, Same-Sex Attraction, even came into existence was because of a few public-facing articles that I'd written. And when those came out, in 2021? I don't remember, earlier, a few years ago, folks from Liberty, queer students who were there at Liberty at the time, started messaging me and saying, talking about the articles and whatnot. And so I know that there has been a shift, at least since I've gone. And, I know that there were underground gay groups before me. I know that there were underground gay groups when I was there. Again, these were not university sanctioned. These would have been punishable by, a fine or community service or a combination thereof, or even expulsion. But I know that afterwards there was a much more concerted effort to create a queer community on campus, off campus, mostly off campus, because most of the activities they did, they couldn't really do unless they were at like a private study room, which I still think is hilarious that they had like RuPaul Drag Race sort of like viewing parties on campus in their library. But, there's that. So I think that there has been a change, not by the university's standards. The university has not changed. In fact, they've actually doubled down on their anti-queer policies, where you're no longer not just allowed to, have sex outside of marriage. So the idea of like queerness being isolated to actions, not identity. But now it says you can't even have an LGBTQ state of mind, whatever the hell that is. But, again, what that offers a state of mind, it doesn't say that you're queer and but it means it's capacious or sort of expansive enough to say that if you support, queer rights, if you have an LGBTQ state of mind, that can also fall under the rubric of an LGBTQ state of mind. So again, they've doubled down. But with that being said, for me, again, I just didn't have a queer community. I had a few queers I knew. I knew a few other queers, and in the very fact that I knew that they were queer, they didn't. Well, they knew who I was too. It's sort of like gaydar, and I watched a lot. I watched a lot of HGTV. Like the writing was on the wall. They should have known, and I think they did know. But the thing was that when I saw other queers, I intentionally didn't want to be in community with them because I didn't want people to associate me with them and say, oh, wait, Luke, you're a little fruity yourself. And we always just chalk it up to being you're Canadian. But then on top of that, if you're actually hanging out with queers, I know, I love that too. It's like, oh, he's just European. Like, what does that mean? He's just Canadian. What does that mean? But for me, I didn't want to be associated because I knew that was potential trouble for me. And so I actively stayed away from other queers. There were a few, the flesh was weak at moments, incredibly bizarre at the end of the day. But nonetheless, by and large, I was very much sort of, in my own camp or in the straight camp, and actively separating myself from queers. But to answer the second part of the question, how can folks support queers today? I mean, I think honestly, like vocal and visible support is more important than anything. I think about specifically, the bachelorette parties who love to come to gay clubs. And we're down if you're there and, you're not like sort of taking over the dance floor and pushing us to the side or making, picking fights. Cool. Everyone's down. Everyone's invited. Like the more the merrier. However, those folks who are at these queer clubs and then go home and say nothing, not just publicly, right? Like not just on social media. I'm not just looking for sort of that virtue signaling online, though that is important. And I'm not only chalking up support online as virtue signaling. But for those who in their private, conversations, in their churches, whatever, for them to legitimately like take a stand, and in some cases a literal stand, like during a church service and say, that's not okay, right? Imagine that, like how disruptive and wonderful and beautiful that would be if someone during a homophobic sermon stood up and said, that's not okay. You should be ashamed of yourself and walked out. What if? Right? Like, and again, it doesn't have to be necessarily that sort of dramatic. Perhaps that's the queer in me looking for a little bit of drama and flair. But I think that the other part though is again in private conversations where someone says, oh, that's gay, or look at that fag, or whatever, or just says that it's wrong to be gay, to resist and to push against that and to make it known that they should be ashamed of themselves for having those beliefs, not queers. I think that for me is, again, it's sure, social media is cool and all. And again, especially if you're not someone who's ever come out and said anything in support of queers and you do post something, that will be a little bit of a shock sort of to, some of these communities. But again, really that private stuff, and also in some cases public stuff, whether it be in a church service, a Bible study, whatever, to actually speak up. And in some cases, again, literally and figuratively to stand up, speaks more than most other things.
Yeah, I agree with that. 1,000%. I had a question more about the conversion therapy part of this. As I was reading the introduction, I was surprised on how long of a history there is. I'm maybe a little naive in thinking conversion therapy is a fairly new idea. And from your introduction, that's not true. So if you could, maybe enlighten us a little bit about the history a little bit, for people like me who are kind of ignorant to how long conversion therapy has been around.
Right. So if we're thinking, we can use North America as an example, but I'll pull in a few transnational connections, but by and large, we'll focus on the US and Canada, because in part that's where a lot of it comes from. And so, if to rewind to maybe the 1850s and around the mid 1800s, this is where the terms homosexual and heterosexual first come into the modern lexicon. Right? Up until that point, these were not categories of identity. These were not understood to be, parts of what make people people. There were different understandings of sexuality that didn't map onto or did not fall under the umbrella of heterosexual and homosexual. So these words first come into the modern lexicon. And from that point forward, once you have language to describe something or to name something, that's when, of course, you start thinking about these things more than probably you would have before there was language to describe these, phenomena. And so people started theorizing, where does this come from? What is it? Is it right? Is it wrong? And this is mostly in secular context, right? So this is medical, psychiatric, psychological sort of context, right? And people start pretty quickly start pathologizing queerness and saying it's wrong. It's a mental illness, without necessarily using that language, but in some cases, yes, they did. And so people started not only theorizing about queerness and heterosexuality and homosexuality, but they started trying to address homosexuality specifically as sort of this pathological sort of phenomenon. And there were different, attempts at changing individual sexual orientations. And this was, of course, these were some of the earlier conversion practices, from lobotomies, early forms of lobotomy can be traced to conversion practices. There were even like testicle implants. So a gay guy would have, his testicles removed and they would be replaced with quote unquote heterosexual, testicles from a heterosexual. That was actually a Canadian specific practice. So there's that. But after that, we're still developing ideas of where is this coming from? How do we fix this? And of course, Freud comes around, being, obviously a much more liberal sort of understanding of human sexuality. Although he's perhaps the best known and also was perhaps the best, most influential, there were others who were thinking about these things too. And again, these ideas keep sort of, circulating through these different professional communities. Fast forward to 1952, the DSM comes out. And this is where homosexuality is first codified as a mental illness in writing, right? In this very influential manual. Once something's codified in professional literature or in law, whatever, right? These ideas sort of are concretized and then they become sort of legitimated by way of the fact that they were in fact codified, right? We can think about gay marriage. We can think about, in Canada, 2005, in the US, 2015, once gay marriage was legalized, social acceptance came around, not completely, not wholly, and we can see that very, very clearly today, but more so, right? It just revs the engine and it brings about more of a sort of a societal acceptance. So in 1952, DSM codifies it, says homosexuality is a mental illness. And again, people are continuing, and especially based on this pathologization of homosexuality, they're continuing to theorize, where is queerness coming from? What are the sources? What are the causes? And, the idea of, childhood abuse being a cause of homosexuality, an overbearing mother for a young boy or, an absentee or emotionally distant father for, a young boy or perhaps a girl, right? All these ideas are, again, in circulation. By the way, both of those theories have been clearly and emphatically rejected by the scientific community. But, again, so these ideas are still in this secular context. Then we hit the 70s. Once we get into the 70s, this is where religion really rears its ugly head. Not that religion didn't rear its ugly head long before in many other arenas. However, in this context specifically, this is where it really sort of comes to a head. And so what happens is that Love in Action is the first ex-gay ministry in the U.S. There actually were earlier ex-gay ministries in Australia, but in the North American context, Love in Action is the first one, 1973. 1974 hits, Exit, ex-gay interventionist team. They are formed, and within a few years, these different ministries start popping up. In 1976, they come together and they have a conference. That conference was the very first Exodus conference. Exodus, of course, being later, becoming Exodus International, was this, well, by far the most powerful ex-gay, quote unquote, ministry, and most influential ex-gay ministry that the world's ever seen. It has a number of transnational connections, and it really is like a transnational endeavor. Like, this is not looking to just do these, to make these practices a reality in the US and in Canada, but beyond. So these different ex-gay ministries in the 70s, they really aren't latching on to any quote-unquote scientific, and I use the term scientific very loosely when it comes to conversion therapy, sort of findings. Instead, they are really basing their argument that you can change on a conservative Christian theology, that through the power of Jesus, one is able to transform and become heterosexual. Then the 80s hit, and this is where the ex-gay researchers, if we can call them that, again, a very generous term for these folks, largely Christian psychologists, and these folks are arguing in their literature that they're writing that you can change. So these ex-gay ministries and these ex-gay researchers, they come together. They form this symbiotic relationship. For one, the ex-gay ministries are given credibility because they're able to, quote unquote, back up their beliefs, their bigotry, with, quote unquote, scientific literature. And so it offers this respectability or credibility. For the ex-gay researchers, they pick up, they adapt or sort of lend themselves really well to these ex-gay ministries. Why? Because these ex-gay ministries are paying for their books, they're paying for their seminars, and they're paying for their conferences, right? And so they form this really, mutually beneficial relationship, which snowballed over time. So we move into the 90s, sort of the peak of the ex-gay movement. We go into the early 2000s. This is where some of the ex-gay ministry leaders are caught with their pants down, literally and figuratively. They are very much, found out to be the frauds that they are. And particularly, we're thinking of of Exodus International, right? The different, leaders within that organization who are found to be fraudulent. Again, they're found at gay bars, they're found elsewhere, they just come out themselves, whatever. Some of them leave each other, some of them leave their wives for each other. It's a whole mess. A good mess to happen in the sense that it was sort of disbanding. However, it did not disband until 2013. Problem is that Exodus International sort of splinters into a number of other ministries. And again, there were a number of other ministries alongside Exodus throughout its peak and, as on its ascent downwards. All this to say, there have been numerous ex-gay ministries. And there are today, really, if you're thinking about ex-gay ministries that are more prominent, we're thinking of the Changed movement out of Redding, California, associated with Bethel. This is an organization that has so much money. They're a terrifying organization when it comes to how much power they have and how much influence they have, particularly by way of their music, but also by way of their pastors and, again, the social media presence that they have. And so these are the organizations that remain today. And today, conversion practices happen disproportionately in religious contexts. Although conversion practices really started in the secular realm, they moved more comfortably within the religious community. And again, there are numerous consequences for that. And they were picking up on all these different ideas, whether they be quote unquote research-based or theological or sort of moral panic rhetoric. But all this to say that conversion practices are still a thing of today. They're not a thing of the past. Most people think that this is something that has been done away with because it has been outlawed in certain places. But like all crime, it just goes underground once there is a law in place. And so we still have this menace to society. And although queers are oftentimes framed as menaces to society, right? This is the upside down world of the new Christian right, where good is understood as evil and evil is understood as good.
Yeah, that was... It is very surprising how prominent it still is, because I very much believed that it was something of the past, something that was a stain on our society and something we could let go of, knowing that there were still desires for people to change and Christian circles hoping that the next generation wouldn't end up or could experience some sort of conversion therapy. But just because those big ones have gone away, there's a lot of small ones everywhere. And then the one at Bethel is obviously a little bit bigger. It is one of the reasons you wrote the book because of your own conversion experiences with therapy, or I guess my question is, in this book, you highlight so many people's stories. I mean, it is so beautiful and heartbreaking and sometimes funny. And I mean, all of it is just, you just weave this together really well, editing it. But I'm curious, why show everybody else's story instead of your own?
So for me, I mean, I was approached, and this is not something that is common. I still to this day sort of feel like, I don't know how the heck this happened. Within, publishing, and I'm thinking mostly academic publishing. For those of us who are in the academy, you are the one who's chasing after a publisher to get your work published. It doesn't often happen that a publisher will reach out to you. Trade presses, which are popular facing publications, not university presses or academic presses. Trade presses, they do this sometimes for sure. And for me, as, someone within the academy, it felt like, I won the lottery because they reached out to me. And so it was literally a DM on Twitter, or the artist formerly known as Twitter. And I got this message from this editor and from this press, and they identified themselves. And I was like, this is a scam. Like they're going to probably ask me to pay for my book to be published. It's going to be essentially self-publishing. So I looked them up, and sure enough, they were legitimate. I was like, wait a second. And so I responded back, and we had sort of a dialogue, and they said, and they specialize actually in edited collections. So edited collections are really just anthologies, right? So they specialize in anthologies. And so they asked me, would you want to do this anthology? They had been tracking my work. And again, I had been writing about conversion therapy, for the past, few years. And they had been tracking the work, and they said, we know your work, and we're wondering if you might be the person to do this. And I'm at no place in my career where I'm in a position to say no to anything, right? And on top of that, even if I were, this was, a dream project, just kind of fell in my lap, and it's about a topic that I'm super passionate about. So for me, it was really them presenting, do you want to do this, this project? And I said, heck yeah, let's do it. And so, there's a little bit of negotiation, but ultimately, it was really just, the only stipulation I had was that it had to be only survivors. I didn't want any fictional accounts. I didn't want any, stories that have been written by someone who didn't experience conversion practices, because to me, that doesn't even really make sense. Like, why are you writing about it if you haven't experienced it in sort of like a literary sense? Granted, there's a film, But I'm a Cheerleader, and that's just phenomenal. I fully endorse that film. So I'm not saying there shouldn't be representation. However, when it comes to a collection like this, I just wanted to have survivors. And so out of all 17 contributors, plus the foreword, which is written by Garrett Conley, the author of Boy Erased, all of us who submitted and who wrote, chapters. My chapter is the very last one. It's 17, and also the introduction, which is not literary. It's more of a sort of an overview of conversion practices. But all of us are survivors, and so all of us experience conversion practices in some way, shape, or form. And so for me, that's really where it came from, and that's why I wrote it. But initially, to rewind even to the articles that I had been writing that the press and the editor had seen, those I didn't actually write those other than to really separate myself from Liberty. When I graduated, I learned very quick. Actually, I learned during my time at Liberty that it was not a good look that I went to Liberty, and I knew that within academic communities that was going to be seen, as a stain. And so I had to separate myself. And the way that I did that, I started writing these public-facing articles saying, I'm not like that. I'm not like that. Look at me. I'm different. Right. And as I was doing that, I was also exposing Liberty for what they do. And that is the fact that they, for, decades had run this conversion therapy program, or should I say more accurately, programs, plural. And so that was sort of how that happened and why that happened. But now, I'm very happy that, it's shining a light on these different institutions, whether they be universities, churches, or, just Christians, and it's by and large, evangelical Christians, who are doing these things, or should I say in the new Christian right? So Pentecostals, white Christian fundamentalists, whatever. But yeah, that's really why I started this project and how this project came to be.
Great. Did you collect all the authors, or were they already kind of pre-picked by the editor?
No. So because I had been writing about this in more public facing forums, my first academic article on the topic didn't come out. Well, there was one, but anyway, by and large, most of my academic work hadn't been published at this point on the topic. And so I had been writing these public-facing articles, and in doing that, I had a number of survivors who had reached out to me over the years. I started forming sort of connections and networks and, different Facebook groups and all this kind of stuff. And within sort of that networking sort of experience, I started establishing relationships with these folks. And so when the press asked me to do this, they didn't have anyone in mind. I had folks in mind that I thought, oh, I'm definitely going to ask this person or this person. And I asked a lot of people, and a lot of people said no. So, you can't do much about that. They just didn't want to, or they had been, sort of they're done speaking about it, whatever. But there were a number of people who did want to talk about it, and there were a number of folks who submitted. So I just started reaching out on social media, and I had made friends with certain folks who were, much better known than I am on social media. I'm sort of a no one. But, Christian Nightmares and Chrissy Stroop and these folks who, I had established some sort of connection, even if it was just online. They started sharing my, posts and asking for people to submit. So when I eventually asked for people to submit, and then they started retweeting it, it offered a good pool of folks who eventually submitted their work. I think, there were a few other folks who had submitted who I eventually just didn't accept the work, and there were a number of reasons because of that, or for that, should I say. But a lot of the folks that are in the book, these were, again, a lot of these were people they were all the people who submitted. So I started working with these folks over, the span of 5, 6, 7 months, editing their work. So they would submit a draft, I would send back my comments, and then they would revise, and they would submit and revise and submit. So it's just this process that takes a very long time, but it's very fun to do. And it's an honor to work with folks and making sure that their stories are as readable, but also as impactful as possible. So I don't change the content. I only would help them with the form and just really getting their pieces to a place that were publishable, and that, again, people would be able to read and want more.
I was wondering about how, I'll talk about myself for a second. I am sometimes the worst critic for myself. The things I write, what I put out there, there's things that I'll put out on social media or write for a local news source, and then I'll delete it as quickly as possible, or I'll go back and want to reword things and have the regret of posting actual thoughts instead of, anyway. How do you, if you have an inner critic, how do you deal with your inner critic, and what kind of voice does your inner critic have in your life?
Well, what does RuPaul call it? Our inner saboteur. So our inner saboteur, inner critic. My big problem is typos. Whenever I found a typo in the book, there's a typo in my story, on the very first page of my story, and I'm so ticked about it. And so I have to reach out to the press still. But putting that aside, on social media, it's always like I publish something in haste, and then right away I look back and I'm like, dear God, I effed it up. Anyway, it's so common. I need to learn, again, that's funny for, my living is really made on my writing, and I'm really bad at proofreading, apparently. And so with me, for me, it's a matter of drafting. So I always say there's the downdraft and the updraft. The downdraft is where you get it all down on the page. You throw it all down. It's not just probably, it is 99% of the time horrible. It's just not good writing. But you get it down and you have it there, and then you start working with it, right? You start massaging it and changing it and moving things around and saying, oh, that doesn't fit there. Oh, this needs explanation. Oh, that's unclear. Right? We have this sort of drafting process that is super important. So I think that sometimes people, for those outside of the academic or the writing world or worlds, people think oh, that person's just, naturally, able to do that. And it's absolutely not. So many of us, it takes months and sometimes years to really craft something that is, publishable. And so there's definitely that. As for, how do we say, the inner saboteur or the inner critic, I think that for me, the subject matter that I write about, I always feel like my life's a movie. I just feel so much of what's happened to me is just ridiculous. It's enters into the world of absurd. And so I think to myself, no, I do think there's an audience for this. And again, when I tell people about stuff, and this was for years of, once I actually started dating, I started sort of serial dating. I just loved it. It was very fun to go on dates and, meet new guys. And it was just, a thing. And as I was doing this, I was realizing that I was developing certain skills like storytelling skills. And of course, my time in the church absolutely shaped how I tell stories, how I speak today. I sermonize all the time when I lecture, and I know that I sound like I'm giving a sermon, and people have told me that I sound like I'm giving a sermon. However, all these sort of influences, right? But when I would go on these dates, I would tell people stories, and they would look at me like I was crazy. And again, I was in Toronto, right? So it was very much this secular, non-religious sort of city. And most people find religion just very off-putting. So when they hear that you have this background, they're mind blown. So I started realizing, I think there's some stories here that I could eventually write about. I just started writing them down, right? Just a list of this time and this time and this time. And I have all these ridiculous things that I've gone through, and I put myself through whatever throughout the years. So I think that, I think for me, like, then there's not just the question of what is in the story, but also how do you tell it? That again, like, there is the critic, right? But that critic, I think, is helpful because for me, it just means that I need to workshop and workshop and workshop. Where if there's a part of the story where I'm like, that doesn't sound right, or that doesn't feel sort of natural, or that seems forced or whatever, you just sit with it until it finally is time to go forward with it. And then on top of all of that, you also have readers who are reading your work in community with you. And that is so important. That's so helpful to make sure that your writing's in a place that it needs to be in order to be published.
Yeah. So on the same kind of question or similar vein of the question, those are the things that are like, can kind of, the things that we criticize about what our work or whatever, but what is something that's like saving you right now? What's something that fills you up with joy and that gives you a sense of peace in your life at this moment? I'm
going to sound like a workaholic. I love my work so much. Like, I sincerely, I go to bed thinking about it. I wake up thinking about it. I dream about my work all the time. It's just ridiculous. And sometimes it actually is really productive, right? Like, you get these dreams and you're like, oh my gosh, this needs to be written down because this is what happened. I forgot about this, or like this aspect, I could frame it this way. So I'm obsessed. Like, I'm absolutely obsessed with my work. And I could not imagine doing anything else, than what I do. So I know that for me, that sounds just pitiful, doesn't it? Like, I love work. Oh my God, embarrassing, eh? But I do. I just love it. And every day I get up, I feel very, grateful that I get to do it. And then I get excited to do it. And then I sit there. For me, I love to sit for long periods of time. I'm not someone who can break up my work and go from this to this. I just get distracted and I do nothing by the end of the day. But if I can sit there and focus, I will write for a good 5, 6, 7, up to 8 hours a day, just writing. And I just love it. Like, I sit there and I'm obsessed. Like, I'm sincerely obsessed. And so that's probably not like a healthy answer. And it's probably not even a good answer, but it absolutely is the honest answer that's where I get so much of my meaning, I think, in part. And not to say that I gave up my faith in the past. Now I find meaning in this, and it's my new religion. That's not it. But it is something that I find a lot of meaning in. I also just really enjoy it. Like, when I come up with a good pun, I feel like the bee's knees. I have so many subtitles and titles that are just ridiculous that I've come up with that at least I think they are. Maybe I enjoy my humor too much, but I just find it really funny. And so that for me is like really exciting when that happens. And so, again, it's not probably a healthy answer, but it is the answer that I'll give, that I love my work.
And do you love your work for the sake of other people? Like, are you writing these things and you're like, I cannot wait to get this out there and to influence or to impact other people? Or is it just for you? Or is it kind of both?
For me, there's not much of I think a lot of people in the past have said that, a lot of your writing must be therapeutic. And it has been for a very long time, especially in the years right after Liberty in grad school and then beyond, from my master's and then into my PhD. These were very, very important, times, because I did talk about in some of my classes Liberty stuff and evangelical stuff. And I would write about this for academic purposes. And it was therapeutic. There was a really helpful way that critical theory, and just literature in general. Most of my background's actually in literature. How it helped me think through and feel through a lot of the BS that I've sort of gone through throughout the past few years. But now I wouldn't necessarily say it feels therapeutic. I mean, I love it, but it's not necessarily. I wouldn't identify it, at least primarily, as therapeutic. But when it comes to whether this writing's for me or for someone else, again, I still think I take a lot of joy in it. I really do enjoy the process. But I don't write it just for myself. And in fact, audience is at the forefront of my mind all the time, right? Like, if you think about different writing, like if you're writing to your sister, your brother, or if you're writing to your boss, or if you're writing to, someone you don't know, you have to think about how you're going to change based on your audience, right? And so for me, I'm writing a lot of work that's more public facing. So it's not necessarily for academics, and I don't want just academics to read it because that severely limits my readership. So I'm always thinking, for other folks. And really my target audience by and large is, the ex-evangelical community, those who were evangelical and are no longer, but also those who are beyond the religious, realm of things or sphere of things. I think about, I want people who didn't grow up in this or people who weren't exposed to this to understand what I'm saying. And so trying to really make sure that what I say is for everyone. Not that I'm, all things to all people kind of thing, or trying to be, but I'm doing my best to do that. To, of course, invoke a little, Christianese. But I think that by and large, I can't wait for people to read my puns. I am such a cheap date for a pun. And honest to goodness, that is such a motivating factor that I can't wait for people to read the table of contents of, some of these books, because goodness, I'm excited about my work, and again, I'm hoping others will be too. So.
Oh gosh. Do you have a good pun that you can share with us right now?
You know what? I'm always terrified that people are going to steal my puns. Isn't that terrible?
Good. Well, what's one that you already have written down that's already like documented as yours? No one can take it.
Again, it's really the next few books, which I've covered in secrecy in the sense that I don't tell anyone even what it's about or what they're about. But those ones, there are some that I was just reading to my friend today. I have a friend, straight guy. We became really, really good friends when I was at University of Calgary. He also went to Liberty, sort of just coincidentally. And I remember him because I thought he was so handsome, but then he doesn't remember me for many reasons. I'm sort of unremarkable. And so he and I become really good friends, and we were chatting, we were FaceTiming today, and I just started reading him different sections of the next book because he's getting one of my conversation partners, and he reads all my stuff and then he gives me, feedback. And we were just sitting there dying laughing because it's just like, I try to make it highbrow, but also it's absolutely just like potty humor at the same time. It's kind of both. You're trying to strike that balance. And so that's where I'm at right now. Again, I wish I could give you an example because I don't have even shame. Well, shame, sex, attraction, there's a pun, right? It's a play on words.
Yeah, that is. You're right. It was a good one.
So that is an original pun that I came up with. And so I suppose I'll offer that if that works.
Thanks.
Well, you bring up the title, and that is interesting because it brings up a question I had, and that is shame, right? And it's this idea, and it is interwoven within all the stories, this idea of shame and fear. I guess my question is, how do you see shame fitting into all these stories?
Yeah.
Because it does.
So it 100% does. And I actually talked with authors, and I think you only have one, maybe two stories that explicitly use the word shame or ashamed. Every other one, I told them to cut it because it's the principle of, the writing principle of show, don't tell. And there were a few who just refused. And so I said, I acquiesced at the end of the day. However, to your point, shame is woven throughout. It's so visible throughout all of these stories, even if only one, maybe two, have the word shame or ashamed. And so for me, when I think about conversion therapy, I think about shame as operating in two major senses. One, the motivating factor of why folks go into conversion therapy oftentimes, and the number one fruit of conversion therapy. And of course, it's bad fruit. So folks, by and large, who go to conversion therapy, go into this quote unquote willingly. And we can talk more about the idea of agency and choice. And I think it's much more complicated than, I'm making it out to seem right now, or out to be right now. But for those who do go into it willingly, and again, there are some people who are forced and some people who just sort of go into it, get it over with, and then leave and pretend that they've been fixed and so they can get the heck out of this, space. For those who are there, again, quote unquote, willingly, they're there and they are motivated largely by shame, right? You would not try to change a constitutive part of who you are if it were not for the fact that you felt bad about that constitutive part of who you are. And so what oftentimes happens is that within conversion, spaces or conversion practice, within these different, religious contexts largely, but again, other contexts as well, is that they frame queerness not as queerness. They actually say that no one is queer, that all people are latent heterosexuals or heterosexuals. And for those who are queer, they're not queer. They just struggle with same-sex attraction, which is a way of divorcing the identity from the individual, right? It's saying you're not actually like, same-sex. Well, you're same-sex attracted. That's what you struggle with. You're not actually queer. That's not part of who you are. That's a change. And of course, that affords them, again, the illusion of the delusion that they're able to change. And so when I was thinking about a title, I was thinking, well, what's one of the motivating factors of bringing folks into conversion therapy? Again, it really is shame. And it's also, again, it's actually in a recent Canadian study, it's the number one cited consequence of conversion practices. And so it's both, again, what brings people in, and it's also what holds people there. And then on top of that, it's what people take with them afterwards. And so shame is integral to conversion practices. And that's why, of course, it's, figures prominently in the collection itself.
Yeah, that sense of shame, not just the shame that brought them into a place like that and the shame that holds a person in a place like that. But then once that person has been set free from needing to convert or whatever it is, when they're free to be their full self, the shame that comes about with what they've had to do to distance themselves from themselves. And that must follow people around for a long time, even though I'm sure most people who go into those places are going in with hope and altruism and, the sense of like, okay, this is gonna make my family love me again. This is gonna make God love me again. But then once they finally can see their full self, then there's probably a little bit of shame that leaves after that.
I think so. And I think on top of that, there's also what researchers refer to as moral injury. So it's not just that, one feels ashamed, and people do feel, I feel mostly ashamed at this point that I was an evangelical. That's what I feel ashamed of at this point. I for a long time, I felt so stupid. I was like, and for someone who, my entire vocation is based upon my ability to think and think critically, I for so long was duped. I for so long believed this. I really did, again, put in my 110% in order to change. And of course, looking back now, it's crazy to me, right? It's crazy to me that anyone would ever believe this. And yet I was one of the people who wholeheartedly believed that this the change was possible, that I could become, through Jesus and, a lot of effort, straight. And so that for me, I felt ashamed for a very long time. I felt goofy. I felt dumb. I felt like ridiculous. The other part, though, is the moral injury. And the moral injury, again, when we think about moral injury, it's where you are witness to and or are complicit in the victimization of others, right? And there's shame that comes up because of that as well, right? So if you were someone who was pushing, another person in the direction of conversion therapy, or you were in a group with that person and you were really, again, affirming that they could change, and of course they can't, if that was part of your experience, what oftentimes these folks describe is this moral injury. They feel, bad because of what they did. They feel like, oh gosh, I was complicit in the victimization of someone else. And that really is what we mean by moral injury. And so there's definitely shame around that as well. So I think there are so many contributing factors for why people feel negatively before, during, and after, conversion practices. And these are just some of them.
Yesterday was Sunday, and I taught a sermon on those parables that Jesus teaches about the lost sheep and the lost coin and the lost son. I only got to the first two, but this sense of like the lost sheep and how there's so much pressure placed on church leaders or even on Christians and especially evangelicals that we have to go seek and save the lost. Like we have to find out where they went and bring them back home. And this is the whole missionary movement and everything like that. And I just was so stuck on the fact that a lot of people don't want to be found. And the only reason that they're lost, quote unquote lost, is because it's not safe for them to be found. It's not safe for them to come home. And so I'm wondering, like, how do we how would you, I know you're not a part of a church and you don't consider yourself a spiritual person, but in its best state, how could a spiritual community be a place of welcoming, and instead of expecting somebody to come back and assimilate to the things that maybe had harmed them in the first place or places that they didn't feel safe in, how do we create spaces where people can feel more welcomed, cared for, and included? For me, I went to divinity school. And it was there that there was a professor. She was a professor of New Testament studies. She was a Jewish gal, and she was just this like whip. Like she was so damn smart. She was just brilliant. And she always said that, she's like, I'm Jewish and I don't give two hoots whatever religious tradition you are. She says, if you're Baptist, cool. What I want at the end of this class is for you to be a better Baptist. If you're a Presbyterian, I don't care. I just want you to be a better Presbyterian by the end of this. For me, I don't care if someone's a person of faith or not. For me, I just hope that we're all better at the end of the day, through a conversation that we're able to, again, where it's two people, not just one person speaking, but both of us, or multiple people, having sort of multiple voices included, where we can just be better people, right? And I hope that that's what all of these sorts of, publications that I put out, I want this to be a conversation starter and not an end, right? So for me, I hope that, again, I'm not a person of faith anymore, but I have no problem going to a church. I have no problem, being there and having these conversations, because I think that they're important. And again, if you come from a Christian perspective or an agnostic perspective or, whatever perspective, let's just all be better. And so for me, when I think about a congregation being affirming, I think that, it's always funny. Like, I think when we are not in a minority position, right? So if we're not a racialized person
if we are not, a woman, if we are not queer, right? If we're not, take your pick on what sort of whatever identity, marker or category. If someone's part of the hegemonic or sort of like the dominant group, we don't hear some of the things that we say, right? And so often you'll have people say things like, like, I love you even if you're gay. And you're like, what? Like, sorry, that was never the question. Like, at least not for me. I didn't think that you had to sort of preface that, but just to say, I love you. Like, I think it's both so simple, but it's also so radical, right? To simply just love someone for who they are without those qualifiers. Right. And I think that it's like, I love you even still. I love you despite. I love all these kind of things. I don't care that it's like, I don't care that you're straight. Did I have to tell you that I don't care that you're straight for me to love you? Like, no, like, I don't give two hoots what you are. Just be decent. Right. And I think that I think what I'm saying is like, be cognizant of the language you use, but then there's also the other side of things, right? Where people will then become so nervous to say anything because they're like, oh gosh, I don't want to mess up. I don't want to say something I shouldn't. And it's also like, don't be weird around me. I'm not going to be weird around you. You don't be weird around me. Let's like call it, a day. And so I think that people either are not careful enough or are too careful, and both stymie a natural flow of conversation. So I think that that's huge. I think, again, even just having something as simple as a rainbow on your church door, and, maybe that's going to get your church sort of vandalized or egged or whatever. And it's like, I say, if in fact it's something that's important to you, that you want these folks in there, then maybe it's worth getting vandalized. Maybe it is worth getting, whatever, something thrown at your front door. Little things like that. I think it's important that when sermons are being preached, to use, again, I'm not saying that like, if people say God the Father, okay, cool. But also like throw in God the Mother sometimes, see what happens, right? Like, I'm not saying choose, I'm not telling you in a prescriptive way, like you should say this, but why not? Like I still remember I had this TA, and he was just, again, such a bright guy. And he would be, lecturing us in our tutorial. And every so often he was referring to God, he'd say she. And again, I was still 1 foot in the evangelical camp at this point. And I was like, wait, what? Did I just hear that correctly? And he just didn't skip a beat. He just kept going. And I was like, and I kind of loved it because, again, at this point, I was also identifying as queer. And so I was like, wait a second. And you're referring to God as they. Like, all of these things, right? Like, because God's not one gender. God's genderful. God's full of gender, right? Like, if we actually look at Scripture and see the different metaphors used and the names used and the pronouns used, all of this, we can see God identifies in a multiplicity of ways. Jesus refers to, God as, or himself as a mother hen, right? All these different sort of like gender inclusive ways of identifying. I think that throwing things in like that, it just makes someone feel safe. It's not where it feels performative. It's not where someone, it's making a big spectacle, like God's this and like God's genderful. It's like, or just sometimes just throw it in and see what happens and see what like how people respond, because some people will be pissed and good. Have that disruptive ethic. And some people will not be. And some people are like, hey, I heard that you said that, and I think that's cool. And maybe they won't say that, but again, at least they feel a little bit safer. It's these little things, and it's not being over the top. It's not being too much. It's just making, an effort. And that I think people recognize, they're like, cool, then I feel better and I want to be here more. And these are some ways to do it.
I love that. Is there anything that you feel like you would want to share lastly before we close out? Anything else that's like on your heart, or you just really wanted to make sure that our listeners understand?
You know what? I always, in any talk I give about conversion practices, I always draw upon the research of my friend, Christine Robinson, who right now, not to brag, but I am co-authoring a book chapter with her. I feel like so cool. I feel like I'm like, like what's the word? Like if, I'm playing like in the NBA, I got an invitation to play in the NBA for somebody who likes basketball. I'm like this amateur, and then, she wants to write this with me, and I'm like, oh my gosh. So I feel very cool. It's like my academic crush. And she's just wonderful. She's this power academic out of James Madison University, and I just love her work, and all of her work I bring into mine. And so one of her arguments, and I think it's just such a wonderfully distilled argument. I think it's so well constructed. And again, I encourage everyone. Her name's Christine Robinson, Christine M. Robinson, and her partner, actually co-writer and partner, wife, Sue E. So Sue space letter E as initial, Spivey, S-P-I-V-E-Y. They wrote this article called Genocidal Intentions. And I don't remember the rest of the title. So apparently it's made an impact, but I need to go and look at the subtitle. And so they write this article, and it's publicly accessible. Anyone can get it. I love that they do this with their research. They make sure that there are no paywalls obstructing people who are outside of the academy to look at their writings. So in this article, again, this is their argument, and I simply just want to parrot it, and I want to share this with everyone because I think it's super, super important. I'm like the gospel according to Luke as it relates to Christine and Sue. And so they write in this article that conversion practices are informed by genocidal intentions. And this sounds perhaps like a, histrionic or a dramatic or ridiculous according to some claim. However, if we are to put it very simply, and they also write very simply in the sense that they make their writing very accessible. I don't mean simple in a pejorative sense. I mean in an accessible sense. With their writing, they argue, and again, it is sort of the state of affairs. If conversion practitioners could have their way, queer people would not exist. Right? And, whether that be queer vitality, whether that be queer representation, whether that be queer, expression, whether that just be being, if these folks could have their way, if they could choose, I and my fellow queers would not exist. And as we know, genocide is not always a physical thing as it relates to death or murder. And I say murder, not killing. But it is also and can be a cultural genocide. We could think about Indigenous folks in North America specifically, right? That there have been a number of attempts to erase this group and get rid of their indigeneity and assimilate them into their wider culture. This is also an effort to get rid of an entire people group that continues until today. And so if we are to be, socially minded or, interested in questions of justice and ethics, and we are we want to think about, instances of genocide across the globe. And unfortunately, there are many from which we can choose. I hope that anyone who's listening and wants there to be an end to genocide, and of course, these are lofty ideals that are never going to come to realization. Why? Because humans are terrible. But I hope that they add to that list of genocides or attempted genocides, should I say more accurately, as it relates to conversion practices, because these are people who want queers gone. And the beautiful thing is, even if they were to murder all of us, if in 20 years we'd all crop back up. Queers just don't go away. And so there's that. But that's what I would say I want people to leave with. And I want to attribute this research to my friends, because they do fabulous work. And I think it's important to share this and to frame this, because when we understand conversion practices in that sense, the stakes are higher, even though they shouldn't have been. They should have been, we should be fighting this no matter what. But I think when we put it in that way, we're able to see it perhaps in a way that catalyzes action more so.
Thank you for that, Lucas. Thank you. John, do you have any last thoughts?
No, I just want to thank you for taking the time to come and speak with us. This has been an amazing conversation.
Thank you for listening to This Is Not Church. Be sure to rate and review the podcast on your platform of choice. If you would like to partner with us, visit patreon.com/thisisnotchurch, where you will receive exclusive content such as early access to episodes, videos of upcoming episodes, and live Q&A sessions. Be sure to check out our Facebook group or follow us on Twitter and Instagram. All the links are in the show notes. We'll be back soon with another episode.